So now property owners can just discriminate against people they don't like. Judge Hayes is abusing his position. This is what DEI culture looks like, punishing successful white men. Preston Whitfield is a job creator and philanthropist. This is a witch hunt. There were supportive comments too, but they were drowned out by the avalanche of backlash. Preston's PR team was good. They'd framed the narrative before Robert had a chance to respond. "We need to put out a statement," Patricia said. "No, Robert, they're destroying your reputation. Let them." Robert's voice was calm. "Preston thinks this is a PR battle. He thinks if he can turn public opinion against me, he can force me to back down. But he's forgotten something important." "What?" "I'm a retired federal judge. I don't need public approval. I just need to be right." Patricia sat down across from him. "What's your plan?" "Discovery." Preston just opened the door to a full legal examination of Meadowbrook's membership history. He wants to claim discrimination. Fine. Let's put 70 years of actual discrimination on the record. Let's depose every member who was on the committee that rejected my applications. Let's examine every membership approval from the past 30 years and see how many qualified black applicants were rejected while less qualified white applicants were approved. That's going to be ugly. It's going to be honest. And sometimes honesty is ugly. His phone rang. Unknown number. Robert almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Judge Hayes. A woman's voice. Young. Uncertain. "My name is Jessica Martinez. I'm a reporter with the New York Times. I'm working on a story about the Meadowbrook situation. Do you have time to talk?" "That depends. What's your angle?" "The truth. I've been covering discrimination in private clubs for 5 years. I know Meadowbrook's history. I know Preston Whitfield's history too. And I know the narrative he's pushing is missing some important context." Robert made a decision. "Come to the club tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. I'll give you an interview. And access to documents that will give you all the context you need." He hung up and looked at Patricia. "We're not playing defense. We're going on offense." The next morning, Jessica Martinez arrived with a photographer and a list of questions that showed she'd done her homework. 29 years old, Latina, wearing sensible shoes and carrying a voice recorder that looked older than she was. Robert led her to his office, the one that used to belong to the club president. Before Robert had bought the place and fired him for embezzling membership fees. The walls were lined with legal books and photographs. One wall showed Robert's career, law school graduation, judicial appointment ceremony, landmark cases. Another wall showed something different. 3 rejection letters from another wall showed something different. 3 rejection letters from Meadowbrook Country Club, framed and dated 1994, 1999, 2004. Jessica's photographer took pictures of the framed letters immediately. "You kept them," Jessica said. "I kept everything. Every rejection, every membership approval I saw go through while mine was denied. Every article about this club's prestigious tradition that never mentioned its tradition of exclusion." Robert gestured to a file cabinet. 30 years of documentation, all of it relevant to Mr. Whitfield's lawsuit. Judge Robert Hayes had never been the kind of man who raised his voice. 68 years old, hands that had once signed death sentences and life sentences with equal gravity, wearing khaki pants and a simple polo shirt that his late wife had bought him 3 birthdays ago. The fabric was soft now, worn by years of weekend mornings and quiet walks. But today, standing on the pristine 14th green of Meadowbrook Country Club, feeling the late afternoon sun warm on his shoulders and the weight of 30 years of rejection sitting heavy in his chest, Robert understood that some battles required more than quiet dignity. They required you to stand your ground. "Excuse me." The voice came from behind him, sharp with entitlement. "You're blocking the fairway." Robert turned slowly. 3 men stood 20 yards back, golf clubs glinting in their hands like weapons. The one who'd spoken was tall, silver-haired, wearing a polo shirt that probably cost more than Robert's entire outfit. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm just enjoying the view," Robert said calmly. "Beautiful course." "I'm sure it is. But members and their guests have priority on the greens. Maintenance staff should wait until we're through." The words hung in the air like smoke. Maintenance staff. Robert felt something old and familiar stir in his chest. Not anger. He'd learned decades ago that anger was a luxury black men in America couldn't afford in public spaces. But something deeper, something that had been building for 30 years. "I'm not maintenance staff," Robert said quietly. "Then you're definitely in the wrong place." The tall man's smile widened, but there was ice underneath. "This is a private club, members only. And I'm quite certain I'd remember if someone like you had been approved for membership." Someone like you. 3 words that said everything without saying anything at all. Robert could have explained, could have told them exactly who he was and what he owned. But 30 years of watching white men assume they knew everything about him from a single glance had taught him patience. Had taught him that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was let people reveal exactly who they were before you showed them who you'd become. "I have every right to be here," Robert said. "Really." The tall man, his name was Preston Whitfield, CEO of Whitfield Capital Management. Though Robert already knew that, handed his golf club to one of his companions and walked forward. "Let me make this simple. Meadowbrook has standards, history, tradition. We don't just let anyone walk onto our greens." "Your greens," Robert repeated. "That's right, our greens, our club, our rules." Preston pulled out his phone. "I'm calling security. You can explain to them why you're trespassing on private property." "Please do," Robert said. Something in his tone made Preston pause, made him study Robert's face more carefully, like he was trying to place him. But 30 years ago, when Robert Hayes had applied for membership at Meadowbrook Country Club back when he was a newly appointed federal judge with impeccable credentials and a spotless record, the membership committee had rejected his application without an explanation. And they'd done it again 5 years later, and again 10 years after that. Each time, the rejection letter was polite, apologetic even. "Unfortunately, all membership slots are currently filled." Never mind that 3 white applicants had been approved within weeks of Robert's denials. Never mind that one of those applicants had been Preston Whitfield himself, 28 years ago, when he was just a junior analyst who'd inherited his father's connections. But Robert had learned something during his 35 years on the federal bench. He'd learned that justice was patient, that it waited, that it compounded like interest in a bank account, gaining value with every passing year until the debt came due all at once. 5 years ago, when Meadowbrook Country Club had faced bankruptcy, a combination of bad investments and aging infrastructure, Robert had made an offer through a holding company. A generous offer, one the board couldn't refuse. He'd bought the club that had rejected him 3 times, and he'd spent 5 years quietly, methodically, making changes, updating facilities, improving the grounds, building value, all while remaining anonymous to the membership, all while waiting for the right moment to reveal exactly who owned the ground they walked on. Preston was dialing security now, his face flushed with indignation. His companions had moved closer, forming a loose semicircle around Robert, like they were corralling someone dangerous. "This is Preston Whitfield," he said into his phone. "We have an unauthorized person on the 14th green, black male, late 60s, refusing to leave. Send security immediately." Robert watched the casual racism disguised as concern for property rights. Watched the assumption that security would automatically take Preston's side. Watched 30 years of exclusion play out in real time. "They'll be here in 5 minutes, Preston said, pocketing his phone. "I suggest you leave before this gets ugly." "It's already ugly," Robert said quietly. "It's been ugly for 30 years. You just didn't notice because you were the one making it that way." "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Robert smiled. Not with anger, not with triumph. Just with the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd waited 3 decades for this exact moment. "It means," he said, "that you should probably call your lawyer instead of security. Because you're about to discover that the black man you just tried to remove from your club actually owns every blade of grass you're standing on." Preston's face went pale, and in the distance, Robert could hear the security cart approaching, could hear the moment of reckoning rolling toward them like thunder before a storm. Because some lessons cost more than money. Some lessons cost everything you thought you owned. The security cart arrived with 2 men Robert recognized immediately. Marcus Webb, head of security, 53 years old, former Army MP with 20 years of service. They'd spoken dozens of times over the past 5 years, always cordially, though Marcus didn't know Robert was anything more than a friendly member who tipped well. The second man was younger, Terrell Jackson, 27, studying criminal justice at night, while working security during the day. Robert had quietly funded a scholarship in Terrell's name through the club's charitable foundation. Terrell didn't know that either. "Mr. Whitfield," Marcus said, stepping out of the cart. "What seems to be the problem?" "This man," Preston gestured at Robert like he was pointing out a stray dog, "is trespassing. He's not a member. He has no authorization to be on club grounds. I want him removed immediately." Marcus looked at Robert. Their eyes met. Robert saw the moment of recognition not of who Robert was, but of the situation Marcus was being put in. A black security officer being asked by a white member to remove an older black man who was standing calmly, not causing any disturbance, simply existing in a space where he didn't belong. "Sir," Marcus said carefully, addressing Robert, "do you have identification, a membership card?" "I do," Robert said. He reached into his pocket, slowly learned behavior from decades of knowing that sudden movements got black men killed, and pulled out his wallet. Instead of a membership card, he handed Marcus a business card. Marcus read it, his eyes widened. Then he read it again. "Is there a problem?" Preston demanded. "Just remove him." "Mr. Whitfield," Marcus said slowly, "I think there might be some confusion here. The only confusion is why you're still talking instead of escorting this man off the property." Terrell had stepped closer, reading over Marcus's shoulder. His face had gone through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, shock, understanding, and something that looked like barely suppressed amusement. "What does the card say?" Preston snapped. Marcus handed it to him. Preston read it. The color drained from his face like water from a broken glass. "Robert Hayes, federal judge, retired owner, Meadowbrook Country Club Holdings, LLC." "This is a joke," Preston said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "It's not a joke," Robert said quietly. "I purchased Meadowbrook 5 years ago through a holding company. I've been the owner since then. Every membership fee you've paid, every round of golf you've played, every dinner you've eaten at the clubhouse, All of it has been on property I own. Preston's hands were shaking now. That's impossible. The board would have told us. The board reports to me. And I instructed them not to disclose the ownership change publicly. I wanted to see how the club operated without members knowing a black man owned it. Robert's voice was steady but carried weight. I wanted to see if anything would change, if the culture would shift, if the casual racism that's been part of this place for 70 years would finally die. I'm not racist. Preston started. You called security on me. For standing on a golf green. You assumed I was maintenance staff. You said this club has standards and tradition while looking at me like I was something that didn't belong. Robert's voice never rose, but it cut like a blade. That's not overt racism, Mr. Whitfield. It's the kind that's so ingrained you don't even notice it anymore. The kind that makes you see a black man in khakis and immediately assume he's either staff or a threat. Preston's companions had gone very quiet. Robert thought about that. About 70 years of tradition built on exclusion. About the board members who'd apologized. About David Chen pushing for reform. About young people like Terrell Jackson, who deserved opportunities. I think people can change, he said finally. But only if they're forced to confront what they've been. Only if the cost of staying the same becomes higher than the cost of transformation. That's what I'm trying to do here. Make the cost of racism too expensive to afford. 3 days later, the New York Times article dropped. The Judge Who Bought Justice. How Robert Hayes spent $30 years and $12 million to integrate America's most exclusive country club. The article was devastating. Jessica had done exactly what she promised, told the truth. The framed rejection letters, the membership approval disparities, the 43 documented incidents of discrimination. Preston Whitfield's security footage, analyzed by body language experts who confirmed his assumptions were clearly based on racial profiling. But the article also did something Robert hadn't expected. It made him human. Jessica had included the story of Robert's late wife, Eleanor, who died 7 years ago from cancer, who'd encouraged him to keep applying to Meadowbrook because she believed that good people eventually do the right thing, who'd never lived to see him finally gain access to the club that had rejected him 3 times. The article included interviews with the teenage caddy who'd been reported as suspicious, with the golf pro's assistant who'd been questioned about her authorization, with Marcus Webb, the security chief, who admitted he'd been uncomfortably with many of the incidents he'd witnessed over the years, but hadn't known how to address them. Jessica sat down, her recorder already running. Let's start with the incident on the 14th green. Preston Whitfield claims you set him up, that you deliberately positioned yourself to look like stuff, so you could entrap him into making racist assumptions. I was standing on a golf course I own, wearing casual clothes on a weekend afternoon. If Preston Whitfield saw a black man in khakis and immediately assumed I was maintenance staff, that tells you everything you need to know about his assumptions. I didn't entrap him. His own prejudice did. He's claiming the security footage was edited. Robert pulled up his laptop and showed her the raw footage. Unedited. Time-stamped. 7 minutes and 43 seconds of Preston Whitfield revealing exactly who he was when he thought no one important was watching. He can claim whatever he wants. The footage speaks for itself. Jessica took notes. Tell me about your membership applications. Why did you apply 3 times if you knew the club had a history of discrimination? Because I believed in the system. I believed that qualifications mattered more than race. I believed that eventually, merit would win out. Robert's voice was steady but carried decades of accumulated pain. I was wrong. Merit didn't matter. Credentials didn't matter. Supreme Court recommendations didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that I was black, and Meadowbrook Country Club had spent 70 years making sure people who looked like me stayed out. So you bought it. I bought it. When they faced bankruptcy, I made an offer they couldn't refuse, and I spent 5 years watching to see if anything would change once the financial crisis was over. If the culture would evolve, if the casual racism would fade. Did it? No. If anything, it got worse. Members felt emboldened. They'd survived the bankruptcy. They thought they were untouchable again. So the incidents continued. The assumptions continued until I finally said enough. Jessica leaned forward. Preston Whitfield's lawyers are arguing that you're using your ownership position to enact personal revenge. How do you respond? Personal revenge would have been terminating every member who'd ever supported my rejection. Personal revenge would have been closing the club the day I bought it. Personal revenge would have been loud and immediate and satisfying. Robert's voice was quiet now. What I did was, wait, watch, document, give them every opportunity to prove they'd changed. And when they didn't, I held them accountable. That's not revenge, that's consequences. The interview lasted 2 hours. Jessica asked hard questions. Robert answered them all, backing up every claim with documentation. Membership records showing racial disparities. Incident reports showing patterns of discrimination. Financial records showing how much money the club had spent on lawyers fighting discrimination complaints over the years. When Jessica finally turned off her recorder, she sat back and exhaled. This is going to be a big story. I know. Preston Whitfield is not going to like it. I don't care if Preston Whitfield likes it. I care about the truth being told. Jessica packed up her equipment. One more question off the record. Go ahead. Do you think places like this can actually change? Or should they just be torn down and rebuilt from scratch? Not ready. 30 years of rejection because people weren't ready. My grandfather wrote that, PJ said quietly, and my father enforced that same thinking his entire life. And I grew up believing that places like this were supposed to be exclusive, that tradition meant keeping certain people out. He looked at Robert with eyes that were trying very hard not to cry. But then you bought this place, and you didn't burn it down. You didn't punish everyone. You just made it what it should have been all along. And my dad watched you do that while he was losing everything. And it broke something in him, something that needed to break. PJ stood up. I don't know if my dad will ever be the person he should have been from the start, but I know I have a chance to be better than he was, because of what you did here. So thank you for giving people like me a chance to learn that tradition doesn't have to mean exclusion. After PJ left, Robert sat with the memo for a long time. 30 years, 3 rejections, millions of dollars, all because people weren't ready. But they were ready now, because he'd made them ready, because he'd bought the club that rejected him and transformed it into something that couldn't reject anyone based on skin color ever again. His phone buzzed. A text from David Chen. Board approved your proposal. Meadowbrook is officially becoming a non-profit. All membership fees go to scholarship fund. This place will never be about exclusion again. Robert smiled. Not with triumph, not with satisfaction, just with the quiet knowledge that sometimes justice takes 30 years. Sometimes it costs millions of dollars. Sometimes it requires you to buy the thing that broke you and rebuild it into something that can't break anyone else. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not tear down the walls that kept you out, but open them so wide that no one can close them again. Then what does? Building something better. That's all any of us can do. Build something better and hope it lasts longer than the prejudice that came before it. 6 months later, Meadowbrook Country Club held its first integrated junior golf tournament. 52 kids, ages 8 to 17, from every neighborhood in the county. Black kids from the Bronx who'd never held a golf club before. Latino kids from Queens, whose parents couldn't afford country club memberships. Asian kids from immigrant families who'd been told golf was not for people like them. And white kids who were learning for the first time that fairways weren't just for people who looked like their parents. Robert stood on the clubhouse veranda, watching a 14-year-old girl from Brooklyn sink a putt on the 9th green. Her name was Destiny Williams. 6 months ago she'd been living in a shelter. Now, she was here on a full scholarship Robert had created, being coached by a golf pro who actually saw her talent instead of her zip code. "She's good," someone said beside him. Robert turned. Thomas Ashford, the board member who'd voted to reject Robert's membership 30 years ago, stood next to him holding a cup of coffee. "She is," Robert agreed. "I talked to Preston Whitfield last week," Ashford said. "Oh, he's in therapy 3 times a week. Says is working through decades of unexamined privilege." His words. Ashford took a sip of coffee. "He asked me to tell you something." "What?" "That he finally understands why you didn't just sue the club. He said you could have taken millions in a discrimination settlement. But that would have just been money. What you did instead was change the system that made the discrimination possible. He said that's what real justice looks like." Robert watched Destiny Williams line up her next shot. Preston Whitfield. "Understanding justice is a start, but understanding and doing are different things." He donated $5 million to your scholarship fund. That made Robert turn. "What?" "Anonymous donation. Came through last week." I recognized his accountant's signature on the paperwork. Ashford smiled slightly. "He's trying. Whether it's enough is up to you." Robert didn't know what to say to that. Terrell Jackson appeared on the veranda, wearing his security uniform but also coaching one of the junior players during his break. "Judge Hayes, we have a situation." "What kind?" 3 men just showed up claiming they're members, demanding access to the tournament viewing area. But their names aren't on the membership list anymore. Robert knew who it was before Terrell finished speaking. He walked to the front entrance. Preston Whitfield stood there with Roger Chen and Marcus Williams. But they weren't trying to force their way in. They were just standing there, looking uncertain. "Judge Hayes," Preston said, "we're not here to cause trouble. We wanted to see the tournament. We'll leave if you want." Robert studied them. 3 men who'd been terminated 6 months ago for racism. 3 men who'd swed him, lost, and then dropped the lawsuit. 3 men who were now standing on property they used to think was theirs, asking permission to watch kids who looked nothing like them play golf. "Why?" Robert asked. "Because my son is playing," Preston said. "He qualified through the public access program. He didn't use my name. He didn't tell anyone who his father was. He earned his spot." Preston's voice was thick with emotion. "And I want to watch him play, not as a member, not as someone who belongs here. Just as a father who's trying to do better." Robert looked at the tournament schedule. Found Preston Whitfield Jr. listed, age 16, playing in the intermediate bracket. "You can watch from the public gallery," Robert said. "But if you make anyone uncomfortable, if you say anything that even approaches what you said 6 months ago, you're gone. Permanently. Understood?" "Understood. Thank you." The 3 men walked toward the public viewing area. Not the members section. Not the privileged seats. the public gallery where anyone could watch. Patricia appeared beside Robert. "You're letting them stay." "I'm letting them learn. There's a difference." That evening, after the tournament ended, and Destiny Williams had won her bracket with a final round that made the golf pro cry with pride, Robert sat alone in his office. The same office where he'd interviewed Jessica Martinez, where he'd met with Preston Whitfield, where he'd planned the transformation of a club built on exclusion. There was a knock on the door. Robert looked up to see a young man biracial, maybe 16, wearing a tournament polo shirt. "Judge Hayes, I'm Preston Whitfield Jr. People call me PJ." Robert gestured to a chair. "Come in." PJ sat down, nervous but determined. "I wanted to thank you for the scholarship program, for letting my dad watch today, for all of it. You earned your spot in that tournament. You don't need to thank me for that. I know, but I also know why you created this program, why you bought this club, why you've done everything you've done." PJ pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I found this in my grandfather's desk after he died. I think you should have it." Robert unfolded the paper. It was a membership committee meeting memo from 1994. His first rejection. The memo listed the applicants under consideration. Robert Hayes was at the top. Below his name, handwritten notes, qualifications excellent, recommendations impeccably, character beyond reproach, reject anyway, we're not ready. Margaret Foster leaned forward. "You'd really destroy the club. I'd really force you to confront what this place has been and decide what you want it to become. If you can't do that, then yes, it deserves to be destroyed." David Chen was nodding. "I support Judge Hayes. It's past time for real change." One by one, the other board members began nodding, some reluctantly, some with visible relief, like they'd been waiting years for someone to finally say what needed to be said. Thomas Ashford was the last. He sat for a long moment, looking at his hands, hands that had signed Preston Whitfield's membership approval 28 years ago, hands that had signed Robert Hayes's rejection letters. "I owe you an apology," Ashford said finally. "Not just for today. For 30 years ago, I was on the membership committee when you applied the first time. I voted to reject your application." "Why?" Robert asked. "Because I was afraid of what the other members would say, afraid of change, afraid that approving a black member would somehow diminish the club's prestige." He looked up, meeting Robert's eyes. "I was wrong. And I'm sorry." "Thank you," Robert said. "Now do something with that apology. Help me fix this place." Ashford nodded slowly. "I will." Patricia stood. "All in favor of upholding Judge Hayes's decision to terminate the memberships of Preston Whitfield, Roger Chen, and Marcus Williams, raise your hand." 7 hands went up. Unanimous. "All in favor of forming a diversity and inclusion committee to review club policies and culture, raise your hand." 7 hands again. "Then we have work to do," Patricia said. Meeting adjourned. As the board members filed out, many stopped to shake Robert's hand. And it included something that shifted the entire narrative. Interviews with 3 other black professionals who'd been rejected for Meadowbrook membership over the years. A surgeon, a university president, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. All of them with impeccable credentials. All of them rejected while less qualified white applicants were approved. The story went viral within hours. But this time, the narrative had flipped. This is what systemic racism looks like: qualified people rejected because of skin color, while mediocre white men get approved. Preston Whitfield is the perfect example of privilege assumes he belongs everywhere, and everyone else belongs nowhere. Judge Hayes didn't buy revenge. He bought accountability. There's a difference. Preston's PR team tried to respond, but the damage was done. His lawsuit began to look less like justice and more like a privileged man lashing out at finally being held accountable. Major sponsors started pulling away. His company's board called an emergency meeting. 2 major clients terminated contracts, citing reputational concerns. And then came the moment that changed everything. Robert was at the club, reviewing renovation proposals with Patricia, when his phone rang. The number was familiar. Preston Whitfield. Judge Hayes. Preston's voice was stripped of its usual arrogance. Tired, defeated. Can we talk? We're talking now. In person. Please, I'll come to the club. Robert considered. You're banned from the property. I know. I'm asking for an exception. 30 minutes. That's all I need. Against his better judgment, Robert agreed. 30 minutes. Patricia Morrison will be present. No lawyers, no PR team, just conversation. Thank you. Preston Whitfield arrived that evening looking like he'd aged 10 years in 10 days. His usual confidence had evaporated, replaced by something Robert had never seen before, genuine humiliation. They met in Robert's office. Patricia sat in the corner, taking notes. Preston sat across from Robert, his hands clasped in his lap like a child called to the principal's office. I'm not here to apologize, Preston said. Then why are you here? Because I'm losing everything. My board is discussing forced resignation. My wife filed for separation 3 days ago. My son won't take my calls. And I finally understand why. Why? Preston looked at the framed rejection letters on the wall. Because I've spent my entire life benefiting from a system that's designed to keep people like you out, and I never questioned it, never thought about it, never considered that maybe the traditions I was defending were just racism with better furniture. That's not an apology. No. An apology would assume I can somehow make this right. I can't. I can't give you back 30 years of being rejected from places you deserve to be. I can't undo the casual racism I've participated in my entire life. I can't make your wife come back so she can see you finally get justice. Robert's jaw tightened at the mention of Eleanor. But I can tell you that I've been reading, Preston continued, about systemic racism, about privilege. About how people like me go through life never having to prove we belong, while people like you have to prove it constantly. And I finally understand why you didn't just sue the club, why you bought it instead. Why? Because a lawsuit would have been about one rejection, but buying the club was about changing the system that made that rejection possible. Preston looked directly at Robert. You didn't want revenge on the people who rejected you. You wanted to make sure they couldn't reject anyone else. Robert said nothing. I want to drop the lawsuit, Preston said. Completely. No settlement, no conditions. Just drop it and admit publicly that I was wrong. That the security footage wasn't edited. That you didn't entrap me. That I showed exactly who I was when I thought no one important was watching. Why? Because my son read the Times article, and he asked me a question I couldn't answer. He asked me if I'd rather be right or be better. Preston's voice cracked. I've spent my entire life being right, making money, building influence, protecting my position, and I've never once stopped to ask if I was being better. If I was making the world better, if I was making myself better. He stood up. I'm dropping the lawsuit tomorrow. I'm issuing a public statement taking full responsibility. And I'm starting therapy to figure out how someone gets to be 53 years old without ever questioning the privilege they've been swimming in their entire life. That's a start, Robert said. It's all I have. I can't undo what I've done. but maybe I can make sure my son doesn't become me." Preston walked to the door, then turned back. "You were right, Judge Hayes, about everything, and I'm sorry it took losing everything for me to finally see it." He left before Robert could respond. Patricia sat in silence for a moment. "Do you believe him?" "I don't know, but I believe he believes himself right now. Whether that lasts." Robert shrugged. "We'll see. He's dropping the lawsuit. That's a win." "Is it? Or is it just another privileged man being praised for doing the bare minimum?" Robert stood and walked to the window, looking out at the golf course. Preston Whitfield apologizing doesn't change the 70 years of exclusion that came before him. It doesn't change the system that created him. It doesn't give back the decades I spent being rejected from places I deserved to be. One of them, Roger Chen, hedge fund manager, cleared his throat. "Preston, maybe we should—" "Shut up, Roger." Preston's face was red now, humiliation turning to anger. "This is entrapment. You deliberately set this up to make me look bad." "No," Robert said. "I stood on a golf green I own. You're the one who decided that was a problem." Marcus and Terrell were watching the exchange like spectators at a tennis match. Marcus's professional neutrality was cracking, and Robert could see something like pride in the younger man's eyes. "Mr. Whitfield," Marcus said carefully, "I think maybe you should head back to the clubhouse." "I'm not going anywhere until this is resolved. I want to speak to the board. I want to verify this claim. And I want—" "You want what?" A new voice cut across the green. Everyone turned. The club's general manager, Patricia Morrison, was approaching in her own golf cart, moving faster than the terrain probably recommended. 62 years old, white hair pulled back in a bun, wearing the kind of severe business suit that said she had no patience for nonsense. Patricia had been general manager for 12 years. She'd been part of the hiring committee that had rejected Robert's membership application the third time. He'd kept her on as GM anyway, because she was excellent at her job, and because watching her slowly realize who she actually worked for had been its own form of justice. "Judge Hayes," Patricia said, slightly out of breath. "I just heard there was an incident. Is everything all right, Judge?" Preston's voice cracked. "You're a judge?" "Federal judge. Retired." Patricia's tone was crisp. 35 years on the bench, and the owner of this property, as Mr. Whitfield has just learned. "Patricia, this is insane." "What's insane, Mr. Whitfield, is that you called security on the property owner. What's insane is that this is the third incident this month of members treating people of color as if they don't belong here. What's insane is that I've been documenting these incidents for 5 years, and Judge Hayes has been remarkably patient about not taking action until now." Preston looked like he'd been slapped. "Third incident. Jamal Freeman, the 16-year-old caddy, who you complained about because he was too loud when he was simply doing his job. Linda Torres, the golf pro's assistant, who you reported for suspicious behavior when she was organizing a junior tournament. And now Judge Hayes." Patricia's voice was ice. 3 incidents, 3 people of color, 3 assumptions that they didn't belong. I didn't know he was the owner. That's exactly the problem, Mr. Whitfield. You didn't know. You assumed. And your assumption was based entirely on the color of his skin. But what Preston Whitfield didn't know, what nobody except Patricia and Robert knew, was that every single one of these incidents had been documented with an external screen, audio recordings, witness statements, and security footage. And Robert had been building a case not just against Preston, but against the entire culture of exclusion that Meadowbrook represented. Roger Chen stepped forward. "Judge Hayes, I want to apologize on behalf of Robert said firmly. Don't apologize on behalf of anyone else. You're responsible for your own actions, not his. I didn't say anything. You didn't stop him either. You stood here while he called me maintenance staff, while he called security on me, while he tried to have me removed from property I own. Silence is complicity, Mr. Chen. You're a smart man. You should know that. Roger's face flushed. Preston pulled himself together, straightening his shoulders. Fine, you own the club, congratulations. But my membership is paid through the end of the year. You can't just... Actually, I can. Robert pulled out his phone and opened an email. Section 7 of the membership agreement. The club reserves the right to terminate any membership for conduct detrimental to the giant reputation and values of the organization. Patricia sent me the security footage 20 minutes ago. Your conduct today absolutely qualifies. You're terminating my membership. Preston's voice was strangled. I'm terminating your membership, and Mr. Chen's, and Mr. Williams's. Robert nodded to Preston's third companion, who'd been trying to fade into the background. All three of you. Effective immediately. You can't do this. I can, and I am. You'll receive formal notification by courier tomorrow morning. Your membership fees for the remainder of the year will be refunded. But you're no longer welcome at Meadowbrook. Preston's face had gone from red to purple. This is discrimination. I'll sway. Please do. Robert's smile was cold. I'd love to see you explain to a judge why being held accountable for racism constitutes discrimination. I'll provide the court with footage of today's incident, along with documentation of the previous two. I'm sure it'll make fascinating viewing. Patricia pulled out her tablet. Gentlemen, I'll need your membership cards. Now. Roger handed his over immediately, his face a mask of humiliation. Preston's friend Williams did the same, muttering something under his breath. Preston held on to his card. This isn't over. I have friends, connections. The board will hear about this. The board already knows, Patricia said. I called an emergency session the moment I got the security footage. They've unanimously voted to support Judge Hayes's decision. Some of them quite enthusiastically, I might add. Preston finally handed over his card, his hand shaking with rage. You think you're teaching us a lesson? You think this changes anything? No, Robert said quietly. I think you've been teaching yourselves this lesson for 30 years. I'm just making sure you finally graduate. He turned to Marcus and Terrell. Thank you for responding so quickly, and for handling this professionally. Marcus nodded. Sir, if I'd known who you were, you handled it exactly right. You asked for identification. You assessed the situation. You didn't make assumptions. Robert smiled. That's exactly what good security looks like. Terrell finally spoke up, his voice carrying barley-contained excitement. Sir, are you really Judge Hayes? The Judge Hayes? The one who wrote the opinion in Morrison v. State? Robert raised an eyebrow. You know that case. It's required reading in my constitutional law class. Your dissent on qualified immunity is legendary. Well, Robert said, genuinely pleased. Maybe we should talk sometime about your studies. Patricia, why don't you give Mr. Jackson my contact information? You're recruiting my security staff now. Patricia's tone was dry, but there was warmth underneath. I'm mentoring young people who deserve opportunities. There's a difference. Preston and his companions were being escorted toward the parking lot by Marcus. As they left, Preston called back one final time. You haven't won anything, Hayes. You're still just an angry black man with a grudge. Robert let the words hang in the air for a moment. Then he called back, his voice carrying across the green with the authority of 3 decades on the federal bench. "No, Mr. Whitfield. I'm a black man with property rights, legal documentation, and 30 years of patience finally reaching its end. There's a difference. And you're about to learn exactly what it costs." As the security cart disappeared toward the parking lot, Patricia stood beside Robert, watching the sun beginning to set over the fairway. "You waited 5 years for this," she said quietly. "I waited 30 years for this. The last 5 were just paperwork. What happens now?" Robert looked out at the pristine course, at the clubhouse in the distance where, for 70 years, men who looked like Preston Whitfield had made decisions about who belonged and who didn't, at the 14th green where he was finally standing without permission from anyone. "Now," he said, "we change everything." The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. that same evening. By 6:45, the clubhouse's main conference room was packed with members who'd heard whispers of what happened on the 14th green and wanted to see the aftermath firsthand. Robert arrived at 6:58, wearing the same khaki pants and polo shirt. He could have changed into a suit, could have armored himself with the trappings of authority, but he wanted them to see him exactly as he was, a 68-year-old black man in casual clothes who owned everything they thought was theirs. The board sat at a long table, 7 members, 5 men and 2 women, ranging in age from 42 to 76. All white, except for one David Chen, no relation to Roger, a corporate attorney who joined the board 2 years ago. Robert had approved his appointment specifically because David had been pushing for diversity initiatives that the older board members resisted. Patricia Morrison stood at the head of the table, a projector screen behind her showing the Meadowbrook Country Club logo. As Robert entered, every head turned. Some faces showed curiosity, others showed something harder to read, resentment mixed with fear. "Judge Hayes," Patricia said formally, "thank you for joining us." Robert took a seat in the back row of the gallery seating, not at the board table. He wanted them to understand. He owned this club, but he wasn't here to rule it like a dictator. He was here to force them to confront what they'd been pretending not to see for decades. Patricia dimmed the lights and started the presentation. For those who haven't heard, there was an incident today on the 14th green. I'm going to show you the security footage. It's 7 minutes long. I need everyone to watch it completely before we discuss. The screen flickered to life. The camera angle was from the clubhouse side, showing the green in clear detail. Robert watched himself standing calmly, enjoying the afternoon sun. Watched Preston Whitfield approach with his companions, watched the whole exchange play out. The audio was crystal clear. "You're blocking the fairway. I'm not maintenance staff, someone like you. Our greens, our club, our rules." When Preston called security, someone in the gallery gasped. When he said black male, late 60s, refusing to leave with that particular emphasis, the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. The video ended with Preston being escorted away, his final words about angry black man with a grudge hanging in the sudden silence. Patricia turned the lights back on. That incident lasted 7 minutes. It's the 3rd incident this month involving members treating people of color as if they don't belong at Meadowbrook. But it's not new. It's been happening for 70 years. We just stopped pretending to ignore it today. Board member Thomas Ashford, 76 years old, patriarch of one of the founding families, cleared his throat. "Patricia, this is clearly unfortunate, but terminating Preston's membership seems extreme. Perhaps a warning, no warnings," Robert said from the back of the room. Every head turned to look at him, Mr. Whitfield assumed I didn't belong on property I own because of my skin color. He called security to have me forcibly removed. He did this publicly, in front of witnesses, with no provocation except my presence. That's not worthy of a warning. That's worthy of immediate termination. With all due respect, Judge Hayes, Ashford continued, Preston Whitfield comes from a very prominent family. His father was a founding member. His grandfather helped build this clubhouse. There's history here that needs to be considered. History, Robert repeated. Let's talk about history, Mr. Ashford. He stood and walked to the front of the room. Patricia yielded the floor without hesitation. 30 years ago, Robert began, I applied for membership at Meadowbrook Country Club. I was 38 years old. A newly appointed federal judge. I had letters of recommendation from 2 sitting Supreme Court justices. I had an impeccable record. I could afford the membership fees. And I was rejected without explanation. The room was silent. 5 years later, I applied again. By then, I'd written several landmark opinions. I'd been profiled in legal journals. He'd argued cases that would become textbook material. Rejected again. He pulled up a document on his phone and projected it onto the screen. Third application, 20 years ago. At that point, I'd been on the bench for 15 years. I'd received humanitarian awards. I'd built a reputation as one of the most fair-minded judges in the federal system. Rejected a third time. The document showed all 3 rejection letters, polite and bloodless, and hiding their real reason behind bureaucratic language about current membership capacity. Meanwhile, Robert continued, Preston Whitfield was approved for membership 28 years ago, when he was a 25-year-old junior analyst, with no particular distinction, except a last name that opened doors. Roger Chen's father, different Chen, was approved. Despite having been investigated by the SEC for insider trading, Marcus Williams, who was escorted off the property today, was approved despite multiple Dewey arrests. He let that sink in. So when Mr. Ashford talks about history that needs to be considered, I agree completely. Let's consider the history of this club systematically excluding qualified black applicants while approving white applicants with problematic backgrounds. Let's consider the history of making me apply 3 times over 15 years, while men with criminal records were approved on their first try. Let's consider all of that history very carefully. David Chen spoke up. Judge Hayes, I've been pushing for years to diversify our membership. The resistance has been significant. Can you tell us how you finally became a member? Robert smiled without humor. I didn't become a member, Mr. Chen. I bought the club. He pulled up another document. The purchase agreement, 5 years old. Signed through Meadowbrook Country Club Holdings, LLC. A company Robert had created specifically for this acquisition. When Meadowbrook faced bankruptcy 5 years ago, I made an offer through a holding company. The board at the time accepted because they had no choice. I've owned this property for 5 years. I've funded renovations. I've improved facilities. I've increased property values. And I've done all of it while watching to see if anything would change once the financial crisis was over. Did it? Someone asked from the gallery. No, Robert said simply. The incidents continued. The assumptions continued. The casual racism that's so deeply embedded in this place's culture that people like Mr. Whitfield don't even recognize it when they're doing it. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere because of how you look, drop a comment below. Share where it happened. Because this story is about to show you that sometimes the only way to change a broken system is to buy it and rebuild it from the inside. Thomas Ashford shifted uncomfortably. Judge Hayes, I understand you're upset, but destroying Preston Whitfield's membership over one incident. 3 incidents, Patricia interjected. In 1 month. That we documented. How many more do you think happened that we didn't see? Patricia makes a good point, David Chen said. I've been collecting complaint data for 2 years. Maintenance staff complaints about members using racial slurs. Junior staff reporting hostile treatment. Families of color being questioned about their authorization to use facilities. Their membership fees give them explicit right to access. He pulled up his own presentation, graphs, statistics, incident reports, 2 years of documentation showing a clear pattern. 43 complaints in 24 months, David said. 43 separate incidents where members or staff of color were treated as if they didn't belong. 43 times where someone with the wrong skin tone was questioned, challenged, reported, or harassed. And how many of those incidents resulted in consequences for the members involved? Silence. 0, David said. 43 incidents, 0 consequences. Until today. Another board member, Margaret Foster, 62, who joined the board 8 years ago, spoke up. I had no idea it was this systemic. That's because it wasn't happening to you, Robert said. Not unkindly, but firmly. Mrs. Foster, you've been a member here for 30 years. In that time, how many times has someone questioned whether you belong on these grounds? Never. How many times has security been called on you? Never. How many times has another member assumed you were staff instead of a member? Never. That's the privilege of not being a person of color at Meadowbrook. You've had 30 years of never having to prove you belong. Meanwhile, teenagers who caddy here get reported as suspicious. Golf pros of color get questioned about their authorization, and federal judges get security called on them for standing on a green. The room sat with that. Finally, Thomas Ashford spoke again, and this time his voice was different. Quieter. Judge Hayes, what do you want us to do? I want you to choose, Robert said. You can continue being the kind of club that tolerates this behavior. That protects men like Preston Whitfield because of their family history and their connections. That lets 43 incidents happen with 0 consequences. That maintains traditions that were built on exclusion. He paused. Or you can choose to become something different. A club that actually lives up to the values it claims to have. That holds members accountable regardless of their last name. That creates a culture where people of color don't have to constantly prove they belong. And if we choose wrong, Ashford asked, then I sell the club. Tomorrow, I have 3 different buyers who've made offers in the past year. All of them plan to tear down the clubhouse and build luxury condos. Meadowbrook Country Club ceases to exist. 70 years of history ends because the people who ran it couldn't let go of the racism that built it. The threat hung in the air like smoke. To apologize, to thank him for finally doing something. David Chen was the last to leave. Judge Hayes, that was extraordinary. It was necessary, Robert corrected. Extraordinary would have been if it hadn't taken 30 years and a bankruptcy to make it happen. What's next? Next, we open membership to everyone who qualifies based on actual merit. We create scholarship programs for young people who couldn't otherwise afford to learn golf. We make this place what it should have been all along. And Preston Whitfield. Robert's smile was cold. Preston Whitfield gets to live the rest of his life, knowing that the black man he tried to remove from his club actually owned it. That's a more expensive lesson than any fine I could impose. David left, and Robert stood alone in the conference room. looking at the Meadowbrook logo projected on the screen. 70 years of tradition. 70 years of exclusion. About to become something different. But the real battle was just beginning. Because changing ownership was easy. Changing culture was hard. And Preston Whitfield wasn't the type to accept humiliation quietly. 3 days later, the lawsuit arrived. Robert was having breakfast at the clubhouse, his clubhouse, when Patricia Morrison appeared at his table, her face grim. She handed him a legal document thick enough to be a weapon. Preston Whitfield just filed suit. He's claiming discrimination, breach of contract, and defamation. He wants his membership reinstated, monetary damages, and a public apology. Robert opened the document and began reading. The language was aggressive, inflammatory, and clearly designed to generate media attention. Preston hadn't just hired lawyers. He'd hired a public relations firm. The story was already breaking on social media. Federal judge owns country club, uses reverse racism to terminate white members. Billionaire CEO expelled from club after setup by black owner. Is this justice or revenge? Judge Robert Hayes under fire for racial discrimination. The narrative Preston was pushing was clear. He'd been entrapped by an angry black man with a grudge. The security footage was edited. The history of exclusion was irrelevant. And Robert's ownership of the club was a conflict of interest that should be investigated. His identity of exclusion was take indio, positioning himself as the victim, Patricia said. Of course he is. That's how this always works. Robert set down the document. Privileged people lose a single advantage and suddenly claim they're being oppressed. His phone buzzed. A text from David Chen. Check Twitter. This is getting ugly. Robert pulled up social media. The story was trending. Meadowbrook Gate. Thousands of comments. Most of them were supportive of Preston.